This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 257 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Today's episode is a bit different and a bit special. It's a collaboration with Jeremy Bassetti from the Travel Writing World podcast. If you have not discovered Travel Writing World, then I'm sure you will enjoy this chat, and if you have, you'll probably enjoy it even more. But it's a great podcast that's focused on travel literature, and Jeremy reached out to suggest we have a chat together. And I immediately said, yes, great idea. And so that's what this episode is. It doesn't need too much more introduction than that. And so for now, I'm going to leave you to it.
It's great to meet you properly, Jeremy.
Likewise, Amanda.
Very exciting.
Yeah, I sent you an email hoping that we could talk about our love of travel literature and maybe do a cross-pollination of our podcast audiences. So I'm glad that you wanted to do this.
Absolutely, because, you know, I run this book club as part of my podcast, and so I have an audience who is hungry for more ideas of what travel literature to read, and I know you've got to interview some really cool people, so I thought it'd be lovely to chat with you.
You too. Yeah, so that's what kind of drew me to emailing you, because your book club, I just very curious, and I'm sure a lot of Travel Writing World listeners would be interested in that. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Like, how do you do that? What books do you read?
Yeah. So it's a couple of years old now, and it's called the Thoughtful Travelers Book Club because of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. And I actually started it because I needed some accountability to read more travel books. So, I love to read, but there's so many books, and, I love to read all kinds of books. And I really wanted to focus on travel books. So I thought, right, I'm going to make a goal to read 12 books this year. Okay, how will I do that? Oh, well, I'll make like hundreds of people read with me, and that'll make sure that I read it. So we have a book. Now, we don't do it every month because that proved to be a bit unwieldy, but around every 6 to 8 weeks, we'll pick a book and we announce it and talk about it in our Facebook group, and people read along. And then at the end of that time, we have a live call. So I actually, a couple of months into that, picked up one of my listeners, Justin, comes on the call, and we co-host it and have a chat about the book. And people who are watching can join in the chat, by typing on the live stream and give their thoughts. And a couple of times lately, we've had the authors of the book on as well in the call, and so it's been heaps of fun. And I now have read so many more travel books than ever before. So it's served its purpose perfectly, but
that's great.
It's been lots of fun.
I imagine that's kind of hard to negotiate in terms of the time zone issue, because like we're almost literally antipodal, you and I. Like, you're in Perth, I think the Caribbean is somewhere opposite to you. So how do you work out the time?
The time zone is really tricky, and I try and vary it. Yeah, the audience is spread very globally. And so sometimes I'll have it so that the Europeans can join in, and sometimes so that the American time zones can join in. And, obviously it's always at a decent time for me here in Australia. But, and so it tends to depend on, like, who has shown most interest in the book. Or if we have the author on, like we had Mary Morris on last time, who'd written All the Way to the Tigers, and she's in the US. So we made sure it worked for the US. But even then, she was so lovely, and it was like 8 or 9 p.m. her time on a Saturday night that she joined us for the book club, which was, 9 a.m. my time and so on. So, yeah, but it works out. So, yeah. But, okay, let's get back to the beginnings of loving travel books and travel literature. Mm-hmm. So I would be keen to know how you first became interested in travel literature.
Yeah, I think a common narrative here is that when someone is a young boy or a young child, they started reading the travel books in their grandfather's library. And I think that's we read that a lot. And
this is true.
That wasn't me. I didn't read that much, for that matter, as a child. But my parents, there was an estate sale a couple houses down, and my parents went there and they bought this huge kind of cache of Nat Geo magazines. And they were old, kind of vintage National Geographic magazines. Like our shelves were full of the yellow spines, right? And here I was a kid and I didn't read that much, but I remember flipping through the magazines and just being captivated by all the pictures, right? And the maps and the people and the cities and the animals. And I mean, this kind of sparked my curiosity for the wider world, you know? But in terms of travel literature, I think I always traveled when I was a child. My mother lives in the Caribbean. She's Dominican, and we would go visit her as children. But when I became an adult and I started to travel as an adult, you know, I carried with me a little journal, which all my friends made fun of. But I think that's like one of the first marks of the beast, right?
Definitely.
So that's when when I realized, you know, kind of like the literary potential of travel and how interesting it was to think about, you know, travel within the literary context and vice versa. But, you know, a few years after that, you know, it clicked in my mind that travel writing was a genre or a thing. You know, before that, it didn't click to me. But somewhere in that period, it kind of coalesced into this thing. Oh, travel writing is a thing, and then I started to gobble it up. What about you?
Look, it's funny. I don't really know the origins of when I really started to read travel writing, but I know. So during high school, some of my favorite subjects were history and geography, and I was learning German, and it was the time, you know, during my time in high school, the Berlin Wall came down, and I was lucky enough to be on a school trip to Germany for a month when we were in Berlin for the reunification in 1990. So all of these things were just so like, oh my goodness, the world is amazing. And because I grew up here in Perth, which is a little out of the way, isolated town, especially pre-internet, like
a little out of the way.
Okay, it's a lot out of the way. And so, you know, to see like that kind of big wide world thing was amazing. We did a lot of train travel when I was on that trip in Germany, and I really loved that. We'd never had that experience here in Australia. And so then it came into my possession, Paul Theroux's book, The Great Railway Bazaar. And I was like, oh my goodness, this is what I want to do. This is amazing. And from there, kind of, you know, the rest of the world of travel literature opened up to me. Yeah, I can't place it, but I used to have a lot of like, you know, coffee table books almost of like the fall of the wall and the end of the Cold War and these kinds of things. And I still have some of them. I found them on my shelves. I can see that I bought them with book prizes from school, you know, during, you know, my high school. So a total geek. I don't know what everyone else was buying with their book prizes, but it probably wasn't what I did. But, and then after that, you know, I've always loved travel. And so they were a natural thing to be reading, I suppose.
Oh, that's great. I think that book in particular is a touchstone for many people. But apart from that, do you have any other memorable travel reads or anything else that's like really influential in terms of your desire to travel or also to like get into writing?
Yeah, quite a few actually. So definitely a lot of Theroux's books. And then when I got to interview him, was it last year or the one before, that was like, oh my goodness, it's full circle. What a thrill. But some of the more recent ones actually, I think, are things that have perhaps impacted my travel and been really memorable. So one we actually read for the book club early on, must have been last year, was The Year of Living Danishly by Helen Russell. And I read it a few years ago, just before I went to Denmark. I'd been to Denmark as a kid, but I hadn't been back as an adult, and we were going for a few weeks, and I wanted to be really thoughtful about that trip. And I read her book, and I was like, oh my goodness, I have all these things that I want to discover about Denmark that I wouldn't have known without reading that book. Things like simple things. She said, for example, Danes really love science, and if you go to the zoo or somewhere, there'll be dissections and you can, you know, kids are always dissecting animals. And I thought, this is kind of crazy. This doesn't happen here. Literally on our first morning, within 2 hours of landing, we'd gone to the aquarium in Copenhagen. We had some hours to kill and it was near the airport. And over the loudspeaker comes this, right, we are now dissecting a squid at this part of the aquarium. Come along. I'm like, what? what? And we went and watched this long, interesting squid dissection. I was like, wow. So those kind of cultural differences amaze me and thrill me. And so that book really did that for me. So, yeah, and actually I have to mention one more. Through the book club, one of our members suggested Raynor Wynn's books, The Salt Path and The Wild Silence. And we've read a lot of books about long walks, and this was another book about a long walk, but it was, memoir / travel literature, but just so beautifully written and so inspiring, and like inspiring me as a, personally, individually to do better and be better, and to think, wow, no matter what happens to you in life, there's all these other things that you can do. And as well as I want to walk that route because the scenery sounds amazing and all of that. So yeah, I could go on for 100 years. So I better throw to you. What about your memorable travel routes?
Yeah. Well, for me, you'd mentioned the book club again. And for me, one of the most memorable travel reads that I've had was Pico Iyer's Video Night in Kathmandu. And I know you're talking about his book, and have you talked about the book already yet?
No, that's our current one. I've just finished reading it. His new book, A Beginner's Guide to Japan. It's just so beautiful. It's a
quirky book. Oh. Yeah.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah. But for me, the first book that drew me in was his Video Night in Kathmandu. That book, and also Robert McFarlane's Mountains of the Mind. Those two books, they're strange travel books in that, they don't have this through line narrative, they skip around to different places around the world. But it was for me that, number one, they're just written beautifully. They're just beautiful books. But it was also for me, really, intellectually stimulating. It was like firing the synapses, I guess, I was like, this is what I want to do. This is me. This is where I belong when I read these two books. They just felt comfortable, these idea-driven books. And I think there's kind of like a weird paradox here. For me personally, I know everybody likes their own different styles of books and genres, but for me, the travel books that are about things other than travel are really the most interesting kinds of travel books. It's not like they're giving us
exactly what you mean.
Yeah, not like a step-by-step account of the travel, but they're about other things, maybe bigger things. And those two were for me memorable in the sense that they just sparked the imagination in that pure kind of literary sense. Yeah.
Oh, I think you're dead right. I think that a travel book that just describes a journey and, is almost like a trip you can replicate, that's nice and it's interesting if you're going to do that trip. But the ones that go somewhere deeper and, have a real piece of the author in them,
right,
where they cross into that real kind of memoir style as well, that's the stuff I really love. Because, that's for me what travel is all about. Travel is about what you learn and how it changes you and what you learn about the world and other people. And so reflecting on that is the beauty of it, I think. And that's why those kind of books really, really appeal to me too.
Mm-hmm. That's funny that you mentioned that because when you were saying that, I was thinking about some of Mark Twain's old travel books that he wrote. I remember reading those prior to Pico Iyer and Robert McFarlane and these folks, but it never spoke to me like these books. And I think it's because of exactly what you're saying. There wasn't something there that I could latch onto that was more meaningful or, for me, more stimulating. But it was interesting when you were speaking about some of these travel books for your book clubs, you said this is a travel book / memoir.
Yeah.
I was curious if you could unpack that a little bit. What do you mean by
that? So I feel like travel, even as she wrote that, I don't think she would have thought this is a travel book. And I don't think that's where it goes on the shelf. But it's all about moving and the being in new places and the stimulation of meeting new people and having new experiences, which to me is what travel is. And
right.
And so I guess that's why. And also her second book, part of it isn't even traveling. Part of it's stationary in a new place. And then part of it, she's in Iceland, which is like one of my favorite places. So I just adored it. But so it's very much, I don't think it probably sits on the travel shelf, but as a travel person, I have loved reading it.
Yeah.
And I think it still is. I don't know. I mean, where's the boundary? If there is travel in a book, it's a bit like some of the people who pitch to come on my podcast. Sometimes I get a financial planner, but I have traveled to so-and-so, so therefore I can fit on a travel podcast, Travel is like inherent in lots of different things. And so, I guess there's like a really definite travel literature. And then there's yes, this book is about traveling, but it's not only about traveling. Yeah.
No, I just find that fascinating because I think travel literature is so important. It's so powerful as a genre that it can kind of creep into other genres. Sometimes you read these lists online, like the 10 best travel books, and half of them are fiction, right?
Yes.
Right. And which is great. It's fine. But I think, the conception of the travel book is just so broad. And this is not a criticism of it. I mean, I think this is one of its powers, that the idea of the travel book is so broad and it creeps into many different things that it's constantly evolving, and it can be many things at once. That's, to me, really interesting as a genre.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think it's because, partly because travel is such a powerful medium for change and a powerful medium for ideas. Often people don't have those thoughts to express until they've been moving or been somewhere else or seen a contrast.
Mm-hmm.
And so even if the main point is not the travel, it's part of, why they have something to say, perhaps. So, yeah.
Right. Is that travel experience is the big bang event of a good book, really. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, often. Exactly. Yeah.
So,
certainly describes my life quite well.
So why do you think this genre is so interesting or important or powerful? Why is it special?
For me, it's special because it's, I think, I rave on about thoughtful travel, have been for many years. And I think that travel literature is often that reflection of the thoughtful travel ideas, and good travel literature is people who can really eloquently kind of explain or reflect on their travel experiences in a way that is both fascinating and inspiring / useful, I think. So, I think those kind of thoughtful travel themes are often present in good travel literature. So I guess that's why I think it's important. Yeah. What about you?
Yeah, I agree with you. For me, I think, literature and travel are both kind of independently powerful and interesting things, but when they combine, I think their power and their promise like redoubles and becomes, something bigger than the sum of its parts. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think when we think about travel, as you just alluded to, like that Mark Twain platitude, whatever he says about, travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I think there's something very true about that, as true as it is a cliche. It can be transformative and enlightening, but I think much more than that, I think like writing about travel can have even a greater power, because it can teach us about the world. It can teach us about diversity. It can teach us about equity and generosity and all of those great things. But I think the real power of travel literature is that much more than giving us that exotic glimpse of the other, it puts the focus on the self, and it helps us, understand and confront ourselves within, the global context of discovery. And I'm not sure any other genre of literature can do that or can claim to do that. You know what I'm saying?
I completely agree. And I think that having an experience and then reflecting on it sufficiently to be able to write about it in a publishable way is something, quite, it's what I always talk about in the thoughtful travel part. I think that, post-trip, your experiences are just as important as pre and during the trip. That reflecting part is really important. And so to write an entire book to a sufficient quality to be published and read involves so much reflection and more research usually, and, bringing all of these experiences and thoughts together in a way that's really powerful. And I agree. There's not really much else that can do that. So, yeah. It's really important.
I want to kind of focus here on something that you just said about writing about a trip in a publishable way, and it just made me think. I've read a couple of books in the last year or two that probably shouldn't have been published. Just not because they're bad, but just because of some of the questionable things that sometimes that we read on them. And I think this is part of the problem is that people can travel and they can write about travel, but that doesn't necessarily, make them cultured or open-minded or, generous or a good person. Some of the older, I'm thinking here, some of these older, we just mentioned Mark Twain and some of his books, probably wouldn't get published today. So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? There's a few of the older books that we read early on in our book club, which are exactly that. And, just they would have had a much better edit today, the long-winded tales of, and then we got up and then we did this. And I'm like, it sounds like my 11-year-old's trip diary. And I'm like, come on,
right.
We can do better. And we do better today. There's some amazing books. But I do sometimes stumble across some of self-publishing has given rise to, people who will write, go on a trip, write it up and self-publish it without that deeper thought and, which, for their own purposes is fine, but it's probably not something I want to read.
Yeah. No, I know what you're saying. And I laud that. I mean, that's such a great thing to do, to travel and to sit down and to reflect on your experience and to write about that. I mean, that's awesome. That's great. I love to hear when somebody does that. But as you say, you put it more politely than I did when you talked about a good edit. But I think, writing because you have something in you and that you need to get it out is one thing. And that's great. And I don't want to kind of throw shade on that. But writing for somebody else and for somebody else's interest and engagement, I think is to take another step in the direction of what we're talking about here, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's a much, much harder and quite time-consuming thing to do.
Right.
Yeah.
So why do we like this weird genre?
Well, because we're a little bit weird and this is good. But I was thinking about this because there's a couple of reasons. One is the vicarious nature of it. So there's some of these things that I read and I know I will never do them.
Like what?
And that's fine. Well, I'm not a very physically adventurous type. I mean, I'll go on a long walk, but I wouldn't go on a, cycling trip all, from the top to the bottom of Africa or something like that. But there's aspects of it that absolutely fascinate me, like the people that you would meet along the way and those kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the vicarious part. Like I will probably never do exactly that, but I love to read about it. So there's that. But then also kind of the flip of that is, I guess, the armchair travel side where things I read really inspire me. I mean, like I talked about going to Denmark and reading all about the Danish culture in that book, really inspired me to think about how I would plan my trip and what I wanted to do. Not so much in the, like, I will go here and then to, sightseeing spot B and C, but the things I wanted to experience, I guess, and to try and be more intentional about doing that. So, yeah. And also sometimes you'll read a book and think, wow, I never really knew about this place. And now I'm desperate to go there because of those people's experiences. So yeah, I think that's the two things that, I mean, also I just love to read and, if it's about a place that I love or or some fascinating people, then more, even better. But, yeah, so I guess those are my key reasons why I really love travel literature. But what about you? Similar? Or some others?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's the marriage of two of the best things in the world, right? Travel and books. What's better than that apart from actually?
What else do we need?
Right. No, exactly. Especially during this pandemic, travel literature has been a lifeline for many people, as you've mentioned here with the vicarious travel and also the armchair travel. It's something that you're talking about going to Denmark, and it's something that I've never done. Of course, I've bought a guidebook and, I read up about a place that I was going to visit, but I've never sat down and read travel accounts of a place that I hadn't been to yet before traveling to that place. So that's an interesting thing. I might give that a go now. But yeah, I mean, the escapism that it offers, I mean, I think the real world is such a much more fascinating place than the world that we'll find in fiction. And, that really appeals to me in travel books. But also, like, maybe this is a little bit too nerdy, but like, one of the things that draws me to travel literature is the fact that this is an artifact of somebody's experience, right? And it's like rooted in a time and place and historical context. And it can give us something to latch onto in the future. Like, posterity will look back at this and say, hey, this is a primary source. This is an artifact of a particular time and place. And, that's just, the history nerd in me is like, oh, this is great. It's literature, it's travel, and also it's historical evidence. It will become a primary source perhaps one day in the future. And that's just, it's great. I know it's something like weird to say.
Awesome. It's like our bookshelves are a museum in a sense then. Yeah. It's just very cool. Yeah.
I mean, that's why
I'm
I
all for
enjoy
nerdy things, don't worry.
You said that sometimes the authors of your book club come on to join you guys, and that's great. So you've talked to a lot of different travel writers for the book club and also for the regular podcast of yours. So tell me about your experiences there.
Yeah, you've had the chance to speak to more travel writers than me, but definitely some of my favorite. Well, I mentioned already one of my favorite interviews was getting to interview Paul Theroux, and I was terrified because he has a bit of a reputation as being a bit of a grumpy old soul. And I was, it was like, and the interview was 10 p.m. my time, to match the time zones. And that's so hard for me. I'm really a morning person, not a night person. So I was like, oh, this will be hard. But he turned out to be so lovely to the point where, I was asking him parenting advice because I've got a son and he's got a couple of sons who've turned out really well. And, we ended up chatting about that as well. I mean, it was quite, it was a real pleasure to interview him. But, I mean, I mentioned Mary Morris earlier on, who'd written All the Way to the Tigers. But what I loved about speaking to her, first of all, she got wind of the fact that we were looking at her book, and she offered. She said, "Oh, I'll come and join your book club." And it's like, "Oh, that's so lovely." She's really experienced and really interesting, and just to be able to ask the questions that have come to you as you're reading a book, and to get their actual perspective on it, I find that utterly fascinating, and that was a really, really lovely chat.
That must be a different kind of conversation to have, right? One, the interview, but the other one is the book club where they're in there kind of responding to the things that you're reading. It must be a different type of conversation,
Yeah, absolutely. It absolutely is. And, and it's really interesting because you really don't know what's going to come out of it. And, it's really fun. So, I'm hoping to do more of that in the future. We've only done 3, I think, that way. But
that's great.
Yeah, it's lots of fun. Yeah, so tell me more about some of your favourite interviews.
They're all great, Amanda. They're all.
Of course, there are no favourites.
Excellent.
Like having favourite children. You're right. Some highlights then.
No, my favorite ones are the ones, the interviews that just go in different directions. And I mean, let's face it, when we interview a writer or someone for a podcast, I mean, I think that most of the times the authors are in like marketing and promo mode, right?
Yes.
They're in that kind of flow
cycle of,
and which is fine and it's great. But, the ones that are enjoyable are the ones that go in kind of different directions. Like you never know where they're going to go. And I remember the conversation I had with Pico Iyer kind of went like that. And he's such a great person to talk to because he does all the heavy lifting, right? He's just so smart and eloquent that, he'll just, run with it. But that's one thing that I remember about speaking with Paul Theroux is that, as you say, he does have the reputation of being a bit of a crank. But he's just like so kind and generous with his time. There's something very nice about that. But I don't know about you, Amanda, but even today, before you and I got on this call, like my nerves, my chest starts to flutter a little bit. I get that sensation before I put on my headphones and make a call. And it happens every time, all the time.
There's always a bit of an adrenaline buzz.
Yeah. But there's also that kind of imposter syndrome kind of kicking in, that I feel like I know that they're just a normal person, right? That we're just speaking to another guy or gal or whoever. We're just talking to a normal person. And I get that intellectually, but the nerves are.
Yeah. But I think that's what makes a good podcaster. I think if we weren't a little bit nervous, we would be, too relaxed and not trying our best, I suppose.
Or worried about sounding like a moron, right?
Yeah, exactly. I always worry about sounding like a moron, but we keep going and people keep listening, so it must be doing something okay, I guess.
Yeah.
But I know what you mean.
Yeah, keeping going, and hopefully this party will last. By this party, I mean the travel writing party will last for a while. What do you think about for the future of the genre in the post-pandemic world?
Such a good question, and it will be really, really interesting. So I have my wish list, I suppose, of where I would like to see travel literature going. And I mean, it's no surprise to hear that I want to see more of that deeper, thoughtful side of travel writing. The memoirs about, really meaningful trips and stuff, less destination-y kind of writing. And I think there are signs that could be what will come, that, we will really, really appreciate travel much, much more post-pandemic, because I think until now it never occurred to us that it could be taken away. So I hope that gives rise to some really interesting, oh, wow, this is now a really extra meaningful trip because of this. Okay, we are very, the extra reminder of privilege, and perhaps, I don't know, all of these events in the last few years making us be more reflective and thoughtful about what happens. But I don't know. It's hard to, I don't know. It'd be really interesting to see how things go in the next, 5 to 10 years of travel writing. What do you think? What would be your tips for future trends?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of people working on travel books now and during the pandemic as well. And because of the pandemic, they've been forced to kind of be a little bit more introspective in terms of the destination. So more local kind of travel ideas. And so I think those kind of pandemic projects will come to fruition sooner rather than later. So we'll start to see some of those books come out. But I think as soon as the gates open, I mean, all this pent up pandemic pressure is just going to burst, and people are going to rush out and go as far and as long as, as possible. But you're saying like wish lists, I hope and I wish that maybe you have a different vantage point from being in Australia, but in the Americas, it seems like travel literature publishing industry is centered in the UK, right? We have a lot of traditional type of travel books, and by that I mean, wealthy, well-to-do men, able-bodied kind of travelers. And one of my wishes is to kind of see some more diverse voices kind of enter the space and, published outside of the UK as well. Recently, I read a book, and actually the book is fantastic, and it won the Stanford Dolman Travel Book of the Year last year. It's Taran Khan's Shadow City, A Woman Walks Kabul. And it's really relevant now because of what's going on in that part of the world. But it's just like a fascinating book in terms of travel literature. And it's fascinating. It's great. And it's, it would stand on its own because it's so well written, despite it all. But I just hope that we can open up, and be a little bit more inclusive in terms of diverse voices in this space.
Yeah, I mean, you're dead right. It's with the book club, I set out early on to always alternate, at least even just to alternate, a male to a female writer each time we select one. And it had proved much more difficult than I'd realized to find enough books written by female writers even, let alone getting into other kinds of diverse authors. And I was really shocked by that because it didn't really occur to me that would be the case. But there are a lot of, privileged white men writing travel books. And I think one of those reasons is they've had the chance to travel more and they get more easily published and so on. And I think that you're dead right. That's super important that, we find ways to really lift up that, the more diverse travel writers. So that book you mentioned, I definitely want to read it. So
yeah. And I mean, I think it would be a great, book for your book club because it's relevant and it's a recent book. Yeah, no, it's a really good book. But I know what you mean.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that said, I mean, we're not saying that we don't want to read any narratives from old white men, right?
No, I still like them too. It's okay, but we need a good mix. Yeah.
So here's a fun question for you: if you could travel alongside a travel writer, who would it be and why?
This is such a cool question, and I'm sorry, but I've got several answers because I just thought this is such a great idea. So, speaking of old white men, first of all, I would actually love to travel with, the cliche of Bill Bryson because I just love his sense of humor. He has a sense of humor that fits very well with the Australian sense of humor, and his book about traveling in Australia, I have read I don't know how many times, and he's so spot on in his observations about Australia so that's number one. Number two, getting more diverse, thankfully, Monisha Rajesh, who's written several train-oriented books, so around the world in 80 trains and, help me out, around India.
In 80 trains, yeah.
Is it 80 trains as well? Right. And I know she has one coming out on sleeper trains as well. And I just think, I love train travel. I love the way she gets to chat with people on the trains and her view of the world. So I think that we would be great travel buddies. I would be happy to travel with her. And then I have one more because we actually recently read German writers Stefan Ort's Couch Surfing in Iran. And I've read a couple of his other couch surfing in China books and so on. And as a single female, I'm not brave enough to couch surf probably anywhere. I just feel like, as a woman on my own, even though the couch surfing community seems awesome, it just feels too risky to me. So I would travel with him because then I could do couch surfing in his style.
Yeah, nice.
So this is such a good question. I could go on forever, but that's my three. So
do you think Bill Bryson is that funny in real life or?
Maybe he's not, but yeah, you're probably right. And I would be probably very, very disappointed. So perhaps I'll just leave that as a fantasy. But, he came to speak in Perth once a few years ago, and I was actually teaching a 3 or 4 week long travel writing course, and his talk happened to coincide with the final night of my course.
Oh no.
And there was, I know, so I couldn't go, but I was like, oh my goodness, how many of my students am I going to lose? And quite a few of them had tickets. Some of them did go to Bill and some of them still came to me. So I always have this little claim to fame that some people chose me over Bill Bryson. So
that's funny.
But you're probably quite right. So yeah. So who would you like to travel alongside with?
I don't know, but I would want to travel with somebody who we can who we could get in trouble with a little bit.
Ooh, I like the sound of this.
I don't know, Theroux. I know he gets into a little bit of trouble when he travels, but also Bourdain, Anthony Bourdain. I would love to travel with Pico Iyer, but he doesn't drink, right? And
yes, that's no fun, is it?
We'd miss out a lot on the nighttime action.
You're the getting in trouble bits.
Yeah. I want to travel with someone who has a little bit of a bad side, someone not afraid to get into a little bit of trouble there. So maybe it would be like Bourdain or Theroux. I mean, those are the ones that come immediately to mind. Although Wilfred Thesiger, I don't think he's a troublemaker, but the image of his travel style is this kind of rugged outback type style that I think that would be really interesting to shadow, you know?
Yeah. Maybe we need to recast troublemaker as risk taker. Taking risks is okay.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm a bit, I'm a bit too safe sometimes, and that probably is I would probably do well by traveling along with someone like that too. So, yeah.
I'm not talking about breaking the laws, but
no, just, yeah. Having fun.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, I love it. Such a good question. I could daydream about that all day.
So you'd mentioned that you teach a travel writing course, and I was kind of interested to know a little bit more about this. Like, what is this course?
Oh, well, actually, I teach travel writing to people who don't want to be travel writers. So it's actually focused on, people who want to write their travel journal beautifully, or just write stories for their own experiences, not to be published, but really just to reflect on their own ideas. So some of the courses I've done is where we kind of really explore all the different ways you could record your travel. Like, are you going to scrapbooking your, bits and pieces and photos with some beautiful writing? Or what kind of ways do you want to write? Do you want to write it's like letters to yourself, or, just exploring different ways so that when you go traveling, you don't just write the travel diary that's, we got up, we took this train at 8:10, blah, blah, blah. You want to write. So basically writing something about your travels that you want to read again sometime, or that maybe your family member would read.
Something that would be
so I've been teaching
like an artifact of a trip. Yeah.
Exactly.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
So what about you? Are you working on your own?
Yes. Yeah. So, I think as with many people, many writers, we spent the pandemic year writing instead of traveling.
Yeah.
And so I actually have a finished book that I'm shopping around. It's with a couple of agents at the moment, so keep your fingers crossed for me. But the working title is Why We Must Travel. So it's kind of a combination of, there's a lot of research that shows the benefits of travel to us, whether it's to increase our confidence or to make us, more open-minded, or all sorts of, lots and lots of different ways that travel really improves us as people and our kind of outlook on the world. And there's all this academic research about it, but nobody really connects that to actual traveling. So it's kind of a combination of my own travel experiences and, how travel has changed me and the people around me, backed up by research.
Oh, great.
So that's, yeah.
So you have that narrative component about yourself kind of linked to the research as a way to kind of talk about that. That's interesting. So writing during the pandemic, has anything been challenging about that process, or writing the book in general?
It was actually it was a good way to get past my frustration about not being able to travel, actually. So, because I, had to kind of re-research my own experiences and go back into my old diaries and travel journals and photos and everything, and as well as the actual academic research. So it actually was kind of a good antidote to the inability to travel. So just, sometimes it was like, dredging up those awful memories, great memories, but they were awful because I couldn't repeat them. But it also really reminded me, I'm very, very grateful for all of the trips I have taken, and I don't have any regrets. I don't have, I wish I'd done this. I really took all the chances that I could, practically to travel. And so it reminded me of that. So I think, I think it was actually a really positive thing to do during this time when we haven't been able to travel. So,
fingers crossed there.
Thank you. Have you got a book in the works?
Yeah, I do. And I have we won't call it a book yet. It's about 45,000 words of notes and kind of
that's a lot of words.
Yeah, disjointed notes and narrative, and it's just trying to make sense of it all. I think this is the hardest part. Staying motivated, but also, getting lost in the research when we can't travel. I mean, that's what I've been doing to bide the time. And it's hard when you don't have that. We spoke about experience being the Big Bang event for the travel book. And, I've been trying to anticipate some of the travel that I couldn't do during the pandemic and that I hope to do after the pandemic by being steeped in the research. And it's a difficult thing to deal with that I'm finding right now, but
That is hard. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And staying motivated, that's just.
Oh, absolutely. It is. Yeah. There's definitely ups and downs. I think I glossed over my motivation and made it sound so easy, but it definitely wasn't.
Yeah, it was a pandemic. I just slapped this thing together.
I just wrote a book. What I did, I had two friends who were also writing books at the same time, and we were very intentional about keeping each other up to date on it. And one of my good friends and I, we put aside every Friday for months last year. And she's in Sydney, and I'm in Perth, but we are writing today, and we would check in with each other, and that helped a lot to know that, my friend was sitting on the other side of the country also tearing her hair out, trying to write a book. But,
writers can be lonely. So I think it's good to have that accountability and that kind of peer group there with the writing.
Yeah, it certainly helps. So, well, hopefully in a couple of years we'll be able to interview each other about our respectively published books.
Yeah, that sounds good. We'll make it a date sometime in the future. So
definitely.
I know we're going to say this at the top of the episode in our introductions, but just to kind of wrap things up nicely here, where can we find your podcast and your Facebook group and your book club? Like, where can we find all of that?
Yeah, perfect. So the Thoughtful Travel podcast is on all the podcast apps, and the book club runs within the Facebook group, which is Thoughtful Travellers on Facebook. And there's also some info about it on my website, which is where all the show notes and stuff live, which is at notaballerina.com. So can I ask the same of you?
Sure. Well, I think the easy place to go to get the podcast and the show notes and everything is at travelwritingworld.com. And there you can find a link to the podcast and your favorite podcasting app. And that's a good place to start. Everything.
Yeah. Yeah. It's such a great podcast. I was very pleased when I first discovered it. So yeah.
Yours is too. I mean, they're different podcasts. I mean, they serve different purposes and they have a different audience. But they're, unique and they're interesting, and there is that overlap in that we both deal with travel literature. And so there's that kind of like natural synergy, as you put it, before between our shows. And I think, listeners of Travel Writing World will also find your podcast interesting because it's not just a show about people, going around the world and traveling. It's, well, as the show title implies, it's about thinking about travel, having more meaningful experiences traveling, kind of connecting those dots in a meaningful way. So I think our shows complement each other well. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Because I think thoughtful travelers often tend to be thoughtful readers who, as proven, I've had, lots of them on board with reading our travel books together. So yes, I think our audiences would have a lot in common. So hopefully they can swap around and enjoy our respective podcasts. So yeah, it's been thanks so much for this chat, Jeremy.
It's been a pleasure.
Really lovely.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my chat with Jeremy as much as I did. I have got a fairly long list of books I need to go and hunt down to read. And in fact, what I will do in the show notes is link to a bunch of the books that we both mentioned, some of our favourites, so that if you feel the same, you at least know where to go to look for them, or at least can remember what they're called. So I'll leave those in the show notes. For this episode, the show notes will be at notaballerina.com/255. If you're curious to know more about the Thoughtful Travellers Book Club, I've got a post on the website that explains more about it and says what we're up to, and you can find that pretty easily by going to notaballerina.com/book club. Don't forget also we have Facebook and LinkedIn groups, so come along onto Facebook, just search for Thoughtful Travellers and you'll find us there. And to find the LinkedIn group, best way is to go to notaballerina.com/LinkedIn and it will redirect you. So happy reading. I'm heading off to finish off another book that I've got on the go. And I really do like it too. So I hope you enjoyed our chat. And as always, thank you so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.